Off right away. She's timely. Here we go. The Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland.
And fighting COVID-19. À l'heure actuelle, le nombre de cas de COVID-19 connaît une montée importante à l'échelle du Canada. Nous savons que l'hiver qui s'en vient sera difficile.
Will be hard.
Pour un trop grand nombre de familles,
For far
ce sera
too many
un hiver
families, it will be a winter of loneliness
et de deuil.
and grief.
Mais nous savons aussi
But
qu'après
we
l'hiver
also know
vient
that
le
spring
printemps.
will follow winter.
Le message que j'aimerais transmettre
The
aux
message
Canadiens
I would like to share with Canadians
aujourd'hui
today
est que nous allons
is that
en sortir.
we will get through this.
Nous sommes un peuple
We
résilient,
are a resilient
un
people.
peuple débrouillard.
We are a resourceful
Et
people,
nous avons un plan.
and we have a plan.
Nous savons ce que nous
We
devons
know
faire
what we
pour
must
passer
do
à travers
to get
les
through
mois sombres
the dark
que nous
months
attendent.
ahead.
Et nous savons ce que nous
And we
devons
know what
faire
we
pour
must
que
do
notre économie
to
puisse
bring our
revenir en
economy
force
roaring
une
back
fois que nous
once this
aurons
pandemic
vaincu cette pandémie.
is beaten.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker,
chaque vie perdue à cause
every
de la
life
COVID-19
lost to
en
COVID-19
est une de trop.
is one life too
Nous
many.
devons donc redoubler
So
nos efforts
we need
de
to
santé
redouble
publique
our public health
jusqu'à ce
efforts
que le virus soit
until the
maîtrisé.
virus is crushed.
Nous ne pouvons laisser
We do not
place
have
à
the
la
luxury of fatigue.
fatigue. Et nous avons maintenant
And we
de
now
nombreux
have
outils
arrows
à notre
in our
disposition.
quiver.
We are better prepared today than we were last spring. Canadians and Canadian businesses now have access to a comprehensive package of federal support measures to help them weather shutdowns ordered by public health authorities. We know how to keep most of our economy, from manufacturing to mining to jobs that can be done remotely, operating safely, even while the virus is still circulating in our communities. We have learned how to keep many of our children in school. Our ability to treat the disease has evolved. As of late November, more than 5.5 million Canadians had downloaded the COVID Alert app. We have the PPE and ventilators we need. We have learned to wear masks, to keep 2 meters apart, and to wash our hands. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, safe, effective, and plentiful vaccines are on the way. We don't know precisely when this pandemic will end, but we do know that it will end. This fall economic statement outlines the Government of Canada's measures to fight and defeat COVID-19, to support Canadians through this crisis, and to rebuild Canada's economy once the virus is beaten. We will do whatever it takes to help Canadians stay healthy, safe, and solvent. We will invest in every necessary public health measure, and we will support Canadian families and Canadian businesses in a deliberate, prudent, and effective way. Nous savons que
All right, that is the Finance Minister. We're going to continue to let her speak, but meanwhile, we're just going to pull out briefly to get some information about what this fiscal update tells us. We'll keep her up on the screen, but senior parliamentary reporter David Cochrane would normally be on the Hill for this statement, and having been in lockup, he's been in lockup virtually, where he joins us now. David, give us the highlights.
Yeah, Rosie, what we're looking at here is essentially a document that is a summary of the pandemic price tag to date, with an outline of all the spending, the deficit, and the numbers are really quite severe. There's been $322 billion in direct spending and aid, another $85 billion in tax and duty deferrals, and it's just punched a massive hole in the state of the federal finances, to the point that the government is projecting a deficit of $381 billion for this year. So it's a significant level of spending, and the reality is that the job still isn't done. So there are new measures and the promise of even more in this today. I'll walk you through the new things today. The wage subsidy subsidy is getting a bump up yet again. It was declining throughout the fall, is being boosted back up to 75% level of wage top-up, at least until March, a recognition that the second wave is coming and that the winter months are difficult for companies. That's on top of the rent program that's already in place. And we have a series of measures here for some of the sectors of the economy that have been the hardest hit. There's a new credit availability program that gives government-backed loans below market rates for up to 10 years for the tourism sector, the hospitality sector, the hotel sector. There's also direct financial support of $181 million for people who work in the arts and the entertainment sectors, and support for the air sector through support for regional carriers, money for small regional airports, and even some money for large airports, and some rental relief there, and a bump to regional development agencies to help small and medium-sized companies, primarily in those sectors that have been absolutely hammered, make it through all of this. There's $1 billion for Safe Long-Term Care Fund, which is to help with infection control and ventilation upgrades in long-term care centers as we're dealing with this second wave and hope to avoid a tragedy there that was as bad as the first. So those are some immediate measures. There's also the promise, Rosie, of $100 billion in stimulus, a second wave of spending that will come after the second wave of the virus when it's safe to do this level of economic activity. That will be spread out over up to 3 years and then wound down as things start to improve. So those are some big headlines. A $381 billion deficit, the promise of $100 billion in stimulus, and a series of economic measures that will help some of the hardest hit sectors. In that stimulus package, a lot of the details are yet to come, but you're looking at a lot of environmentally based projects like home retrofits, planting of those 2 billion trees, building electric car charging stations across the country. There's also a plan here to start overhauling the tax system, to start going after some of the digital giants like Netflix and Amazon and Airbnb to get some money back into the system, level the playing field between these digital businesses and the more traditional businesses, and help cover the costs of these pandemic supports and the ongoing supports that are going to be required. So it is a meatier document than we typically get in a fiscal update, not quite a full budget, more of a mini budget. What's not there, Rosie? Two things. Real concrete developments on national child care, something the government has been talking about. There is a new secretariat to start doing the planning on that, but that is again a promise that is pushed to future years. The other thing, a clear deficit reduction plan. They talk about fiscal guardrails when they start to wind down the spending. The specifics on that will come, but the broad level stuff is they're going to look at employment. Jobs have been the biggest casualty of this pandemic economically. When employment levels and employment hours get back to decent levels, that's when we'll start to wind things down.
Okay, David, thank you for that. And I know that was a lot of numbers to throw at Canadians. We're going to spend the next couple of hours and then on Vashti's show another couple of hours sorting through all of that. And before we go back to the finance minister, let me get Vashti's take on, maybe less the numbers, Vashti, and how this lays out the politics for the government and how then they move into a budget and some of the promises that were first talked about in the throne speech.
So two things I think that I took from it that are in response to the politics around everything. And the first is the conversation that's been taking place around vaccines. There is a lot of detail in this document. In fact, right up near the top of the document, and it's a thick document for an update, that's for sure, not for a budget, but for an update. It talks in detail about the procurement efforts that are underway, not only just for vaccines, but for treatments as well. And that is kind of echoed throughout it. So that is, I think, obviously a priority for the government, a priority for other political parties, but has been part of the political conversation, and you can see that through the document. The second portion is what has been another political conversation taking place around the second part of what David highlighted, and that is the stimulus package to come. So will this be the Liberals' effort to redesign the economy or bring in big sweeping new projects? There isn't a lot of those details presented in this. We just know the scope of what it will be. 3 to 4% of GDP, probably somewhere over 3 years, and $70 to $100 billion. It will likely include something to do with daycare and pharmacare, but beyond that, there'll be some green initiatives. We don't know what they are. We don't know the specifics of that, and so that might, in turn, also be something political that comes out of this. Whether it, deflates the opposition's argument because there aren't a lot of details to grab on there, or it continues to provide fuel for it, remains to be seen. I should say that throughout the document again, and the minister will say this, there is, an indication that they plan to work on those details over the winter and then present them in a budget sometime next year, though we don't have any specific date on that. But again, as David said, the stimulus part of this we're a little ways off from because we still have to get through the acute part of this pandemic, and those job indicators the document lays out will be the ones that kind of tell the government when it's time to move to stimulus or whether there's been enough. But I think there's a ton of questions for the government still about what that might look like.
Yeah, and there's certainly a recognition that we are, as the finance minister said at the beginning, we are far from out of the woods here, and so lots more support is needed for Canadians as they then move into the next phase of this that will come in the budget, and who knows, may well also be the beginning of an election platform. Okay, Vashi, David, I'll put you both on hold there, and we'll dip back into the House of Commons. We're going to hear again from the finance minister the rest of her speech, some questions to her, and the leader of the official opposition will guide you through all of that. Please, let's keep listening.
This means qualifying businesses in lockdown can have up to 90% of their rent covered. We are extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy through to June of 2021. More than 3.9 million Canadian jobs have been protected by this program alone. Mr. Speaker, in December, Canadian businesses will be able to apply for a top-up to the Canada Emergency Business Account Loan and Grant Program. Already, more than 780,000 small businesses across the country have taken advantage of the $40,000 CEBA loan, of which $10,000 is forgivable. The top-up is an additional $20,000 loan, of which half will be forgivable. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, we know that small businesses are the heart of our communities and the engine of our economy. Small businesses are the foundation of Canada's middle class. And we know this crisis is hitting family businesses particularly hard, imperiling in a few months the work of a lifetime and often of generations. That's why it is so important to support our small businesses and the middle-class families who have built them. Mr. Speaker, these measures provide economic certainty to Canadians in a turbulent and uncertain time. They will help get us through the winter. And these measures are targeted and flexible. They are most generous to those in greatest need. They are an essential complement to our healthcare response. These measures allow people and businesses to do the right thing, knowing they don't have to choose between public health and putting food on the table. Our commitment to employee sick leave and to supporting businesses where local shutdowns are ordered are examples of this approach. With the second wave upon us with full virulence, we are taking additional measures to help Canadians and Canadian businesses get through to the other side, to get through solvent and intact. We are providing $1 billion for a safe, long-term care fund for the provinces and territories, making fresh investments in PPE, and preparing for the largest vaccination mobilization in Canada's history. We are providing new resources to help improve ventilation in our public buildings to make them safer, and to help workers and businesses. We are raising the wage subsidy back to a maximum of 75%. recognizing that the earliest months of the year are the toughest for many businesses, and now more than ever.
Nous savons.
We know that businesses in tourism, hospitality, travel, arts, and culture have been particularly hard hit. So, we are creating a new stream of support for those businesses that need it the most. A credit availability program with 100% government-backed loan support and favorable terms for businesses that have lost revenue as people stay home to fight the spread of the virus.
This is the most severe challenge our country has faced since the Second World War. It is our most severe economic shock since the Great Depression, and our most severe public health crisis since the Spanish flu a century ago. Canadians should know that their federal government will be there to help them get through it, come what may. Today, I have spoken about the nature of the threat we face and the remedies we have provided. The fight against COVID-19 continues. But there is now light at the end of the tunnel. After winter comes spring. The seeds we have sown and will continue to plant in the weeks and months ahead to protect Canadians' health and save our jobs and businesses will help us come roaring back from the coronavirus recession. This careful husbandry will prevent the long-term economic scarring that would otherwise delay and weaken our post-pandemic recovery. Mr. Speaker, I'm the daughter of an Alberta farmer. Canada's farmers spend the winter fixing their tractors, combines, and seed drills, and stocking up on supplies. While the ground is frozen, they get ready for seeding when the earth thaws. Like all those great Canadian farmers, the work we do today will stand us in good stead in the spring. When the virus is under control and our economy is ready for new growth, we will deploy an ambitious stimulus package to jumpstart our recovery, spending roughly 3 to 4% of GDP over 3 years. Our government will make carefully judged, targeted, and meaningful investments to create jobs and boost growth. Notre plan de relance.
Our stimulus will be designed, first and foremost, to provide the fiscal support the Canadian economy needs to operate at its full capacity and to stop COVID-19 from doing long-term damage to our economic potential. Key to this plan will be smart, time-limited investments that can act fast while also making a long-run contribution to our future shared prosperity, our quality of life, our competitiveness, and our green transformation.
Will include investments that deliver on our commitment to create 1 million jobs and restore employment to pre-pandemic levels, as well as to unleash some of the Canadian economy's preloaded stimulus, the additional savings that have accumulated in the bank accounts of some Canadians and on the balance sheets of some businesses. Our growth plan will foster economic rebirth in the short term and strengthen this country's competitiveness in the long run. Today, we are presenting a down payment on this plan. These are measures we can begin safely taking now. They include investments in the green economy and job training, particularly for youth and care providers. Rural broadband, airport infrastructure, rapid housing, economic empowerment for vulnerable communities, and measures to immediately build up our health and social infrastructure. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we know that Canada's future competitiveness depends on our ability to take advantage of the net zero green economy. Our growth plan must continue to advance our progress on climate action and promote a clean economy. We will plant 2 billion trees over the next 10 years, provide 700,000 grants to help homeowners make energy-efficient retrofits, and build zero-emission vehicle charging stations across the country.
Ces mesures favorisent les dépenses.
These measures will encourage consumer spending and investment while greening our economy and creating well-paying jobs.
Mr. Speaker, this is a recession like no other we have faced. Women, young people, new Canadians, Black and racialized Canadians have been disproportionately hurt by the COVID-19 recession. They are, after all, the Canadians who are most likely to work in some of our hardest hit industries, including care, hospitality, and retail. That's right. And we know that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples are also disproportionately affected by this pandemic. Our growth plan will be designed with this particular damage in mind and will seek to heal it. This unique recession demands a unique response. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated the systemic barriers faced by Black entrepreneurs and owners of small and medium-sized businesses in Canada. So, the government, in partnership with Canadian financial institutions, has announced an investment of up to $221 million, including up to $93 million from the Government of Canada over the next 4 years, to launch this country's first Black entrepreneurship program. There is an unacceptable gap in infrastructure in Indigenous communities. So our government proposes to invest $1.5 billion beginning in 2020-2021 to speed up the lifting of all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nation communities. COVID-19 has been especially hard for young children and their families. We know that many middle-class families are really struggling. So to provide immediate relief for families with young children, our government proposes to introduce temporary additional support totaling up to $1,200 in 2021 for each child under the age of 6 for low and middle income families who are entitled to the Canada Child Benefit. Mr. Speaker, we know that COVID-19 is rolling back many of the gains Canadian women have fought for and won in my lifetime. Yeah. That is why today, as part of our commitment to an action plan for women in the economy, we are laying the foundation for a Canada-wide early learning and child care system. Just as Saskatchewan once showed Canada the way on healthcare, and British Columbia showed Canada the way on pollution pricing, Quebec can show us all the way on childcare. I say this both as a working mother and as a finance minister. Canada will not be truly competitive until all Canadian women have access to the affordable childcare we need to support our participation in our country's workforce. Bravo.
This is a feminist agenda, Mr. Speaker, and I say that proudly. It's also an agenda that makes sound business sense and is supported by many of Canada's corporate leaders, people who have witnessed firsthand the toll this crisis has taken on women, their families, and their children. We can only all do better when every one of us is contributing to our full potential.
As we build back, we have it within our reach to build back better. Yes, we do. Tackling challenges that hold us all back. Homelessness, systemic racism, the unfinished and essential work of reconciliation. Absolutely. Economic downturns are always especially hard on young people. The COVID-19 recession is particularly damaging in this regard because of its impact on the service sector, in which many students work. Among other steps, the government proposes to reduce student debt by eliminating interest on the federal portion of the Canada Student Loans and Canada Apprentice Loans for 2021-2022. I remember vividly struggling with my own student loans, and I am glad to help relieve our young people who are swimming so hard against the COVID-19 current of this additional burden. In the coming months, we will work with Canadians and consult broadly to design the growth plan that will guide our recovery and set our course for the years to come. Mr. Speaker, our country entered this crisis in a strong fiscal position, allowing our government to take decisive action to help people and businesses weather the storm. And that action has helped so much. To date, Canada has recovered almost 80% of the more than 3 million jobs lost at the outset of the pandemic. Compare that to the United States, which has recovered just over half. But there is still a lot of hard slogging ahead. First, we must defeat the virus. Only then, when the threat of lockdowns and resurgence is past, will our economy be ready for a return to full, stable, long-term growth. Canadians understand that this crisis demands targeted, time-limited support to keep people and businesses afloat and to build our way out of the COVID-19 recession. The support and investments outlined in this plan, including our stimulus, will foster a resilient and inclusive recovery. Fiscal guardrails will help us establish when the stimulus will be wound down. The government will track progress against several related indicators, recognizing that no one data point is a perfect representation of the health of the economy. These indicators include the employment rate, total hours worked, and the level of unemployment in the economy. These data-driven triggers will tell us when the job of building back from the COVID-19 recession is accomplished, and we can bring one-off stimulus spending to an end. When the economy has recovered, the time-limited stimulus will be withdrawn, and Canada will resume its long-standing, prudent, and responsible fiscal path based on a long-term fiscal anchor, which we will outline when the economy is more stable. Mais ne vous trompez pas.
But make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, as we've learned from previous recessions, the risk of providing too little support now outweighs that of providing too much. we will not repeat the mistakes of the years following the Great Recession of 2008. In this fall economic statement, we are being transparent about the continuing uncertainty. We are planning and preparing for all eventualities. The rate of infection, the severity of shutdowns, the deployment of a safe and effective vaccine, all of these are variables in our economic outlook and our path to recovery.
La reprise. Mais, comme le montre,
But as our fiscal plan shows, Mr. Speaker, brighter days are ahead. And we can afford the investment we have to make to reach them. Canada entered this pandemic with the strongest fiscal position of any G7 country. We retain that position today. Federal debt servicing costs relative to the size of our economy remain at a 100-year low. And we are locking in those low costs by issuing more debt into longer-term instruments at these historically low rates.
les Canadiens veulent un système.
Canadians want a fair tax system where everyone pays their fair share, so the government has the resources it needs to invest in people and keep our economy strong. That is why we're moving ahead with implementing GST, HST on multinational web giants.
Et à limiter.
And we are also limiting stock option deductions in the largest companies. And if necessary, Canada will act unilaterally to apply a tax on large multinational digital corporations so that they pay their fair share just like any other company operating in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, our growth plan is far-reaching and transformative. But does this mean that the worst of the COVID-19 crisis is past? Sadly, it does not. Indeed, our country's most difficult days may come in the weeks and months immediately ahead. Hospitalizations are on the rise, and the virus continues to take a terrible toll, particularly on our elders. That is why we must redouble our public health efforts, obey public health instructions, physically distance, wear masks when in public, avoid social gatherings, and wash our hands. We must all do this, Mr. Speaker. We can save lives. Canadians can and should avail themselves of the federal programs now available.
We are here.
This safety net is there now so that people can make the right decisions to protect our health. If we do the right things, if we hunker down and heed public health advice for these last remaining months, we will also be doing the right thing for our economy. And we will bring closer the day when every Canadian can get back to normal life. Most importantly, we will greatly lessen the mortal toll of this disease. Mr. Speaker, after nearly 10 months of the pandemic, we are all tired. But we also know that vaccines and a better day are coming. To get to that day, we must first help each other get through the winter. Our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through hard winters too, in times of war and depression, on frozen prairie homesteads, and in windswept fishing villages in Atlantic Canada, all across our vast country. The living survivors of those days, now our most vulnerable elders, are counting on us to buckle down for another few months. We can do this, Mr. Speaker. We must do this, Mr. Speaker. And we will do this, Mr. Speaker. Canadians have faced tough winters before, and we have always emerged stronger. We will this time, too. Thank you. Merci.
Minister of Canada, Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. First time a female finance minister has delivered economic update. The Prime Minister there giving her a fist bump, the only thing that's allowed during these COVID times. We are now going to hear from opposition parties asking questions of the Finance Minister. We'll bring that to you live as well.
They were expecting they'd hear news today that the government had fixed its failures that mean that Canada will be the back of the pack to receive the pandemic relief in the form of a vaccine that will give them their lives back. With the highest unemployment other than Italy and all of the G7, they were expecting a plan for paychecks. Instead, they got a plan for more credit card debts. $400 billion will be added to our national credit card this year, 8 times bigger than the previous all-time national average. While Conservatives supported the CERB, the small business loans, the wage subsidies, those account for less than half of that record-smashing deficit. In fact, we've gone from a debt to GDP ratio of 30% to 56%. Now, within view of the default levels that we hit in the 1990s when Liberals were forced to slash health care to deal with the massive debt crisis that existed at that time. We are not at the cliff or even on the edge of the cliff, but we can now see the cliff, and this government is running towards it as quickly as humanly possible. The biggest deficit by far in all of the G20. They've spent the most to achieve the least. With all that spending, we're going to be the back of the pack on vaccinations. We have the second highest unemployment in the G7, and we couldn't get rapid testing approved and timed to get Canadians safely back to their lives. The minister has said that she would impose, quote, limits on our debt to avoid the brutal constraints of the marketplace. Will she tell us today, when speaking of the debt, what exactly are those limits? Thank you.
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite touched on a lot of issues, ranging from vaccines to support on businesses to debt, deficits, and fiscal anchors. So I'm going to try to touch on most of those. Let me start with vaccines, Mr. Speaker, and let me say something that it is very important for Canadians to appreciate, because this is a key element in building the confidence we all need to have in our economic recovery. Canada has the most expansive portfolio of vaccines of any country in the world. 10 doses for every Canadian. And Mr. Speaker, we have, like a smart farmer, a smart investor, hedged our bets. There are 7 different vaccines in our portfolio. 4 of those vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are already submitting data on a rolling basis to Health Canada regulators. That, Mr. Speaker, can, should, and will provide a great deal of confidence to Canadians. And Mr. Speaker, let me quote Moderna's chairman, who, by the way, came to Canada first as a refugee child. He said that Canada is near the front of the line to receive 20 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna. And I'm quoting him, "The people who are willing to move early on with even less proof of the efficacy have assured the amount of supply they were willing to sign up to." In the case of Canada, that number is about 20 million doses. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. 20 million doses of a single vaccine, and there are 38 million Canadians. Now, I'm going to continue quoting Nubar Afeyan. He says, "The government of Canada, like others, has also reserved the ability to increase that amount, and those discussions are ongoing." So, Mr. Speaker, and this is very important in terms of building the essential confidence in each other and in our economy. We have an extensive vaccine portfolio, and this is going to make a world of difference. Mr. Speaker, let me just speak briefly about the issue of debt and deficits, and I'll say two things. It's important for Canadians to appreciate that the interest charges on our debt that we are paying right now are the lowest in a century, and the government is acting prudently to push out the maturity of that debt so that we can lock in today's low interest rates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
L'honorable député de la...
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID crisis is a health crisis. Healthcare is a provincial responsibility. It's Quebec's responsibility. Provinces have been hit so hard by this crisis. In fact, in Quebec, we need $3 billion more to deal with this health crisis. The federal government has cut health transfers year after year after year. Currently, we need 22% in order to help provinces. Provinces and Quebec have asked for over $20 billion to get the federal government to 35%. And that's without taking COVID into account. In this economic statement, we hear a plan for economic recovery and yet nothing for health transfers. This is the number one thing that Quebec and the provinces want. The government is ignoring what the provinces are experiencing and what they want. That's my first point. Second point, well, if you want a recovery plan, first and foremost, you need a vaccination plan. We're told that many vaccines have been bought. Yes, that's great. The government was panicking and they went and bought vaccines left, right, and center. Well, that wasn't really the best way to go about it. We need a plan with details, with dates, with numbers. How many doses will we receive? Who will be vaccinated first? Which provinces will be considered priority provinces due to the situation of COVID and contagiousness in those provinces? What parameters and indicators will be used to vaccinate and to deploy vaccines to the provinces, to Quebec? We haven't heard anything. We have no details. Mr. Speaker, the government is not being serious. Why is the government not taking tangible, real action to prepare a vaccination plan for Quebecers and Canadians? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. First, I would like to cover the federal government's assistance and support to provinces and territories, which is historic. Through our Safe Restart Agreement, we set aside $19.9 billion for provinces and territories. We added a further $2 billion for the safe restart of our schools. We are continuing to invest with the $1 billion I invested today for safe long-term care, for ventilation in public buildings, for PPE. We are here for provinces and territories. We are here for Canadians. And I would like to add something. I hope my colleague will hear me. We are here for all Quebecers. We are here for Quebec's businesses. 8 in every $10 spent on crisis management since the beginning of the crisis have been spent by the federal government. 25% of Quebecers have received, in fact, the CERB. So many Quebecers were helped by our benefits. We have saved lives, we have saved families, and we continue to help through the wage subsidy. We know that the winter will be difficult. That's why we decided to increase the emergency wage subsidy back up to 75% as the maximum amount. That's substantial, Mr. Speaker. Now, as for vaccines, Quebecers should be proud of Mr. Noubar Afayette. He is a Quebecer. His family still lives in Quebec. Canada welcomes refugees with open arms, and that is why the world has that vaccine. That's what we heard on Radio Canada yesterday. He said countries who are ready to act quickly without full proof of efficacy are able to ensure for their countries several doses, securing doses. And it's so true, Mr. Speaker. We will have 20 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, we have 1 minute for a final question, 30 seconds for a question, and 30 seconds for an answer.
Minister Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Canadians are struggling to put food on the table, struggling to keep a roof over their head. But when they read the economic update, what they will see is austerity is coming, Mr. Speaker. Now, we know during this pandemic so far, we've seen $53 billion wealth going to Canada's billionaires. But in this document, we see no wealth tax, we see no excess profits tax. The web giants are not obliged to pay $1 of corporate tax. So for the pandemic and for the rebuilding, the question is very simple. Why does this government continue to refuse to have Canada's billionaires pay their fair share?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister in 30 seconds or less, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'm accustomed in this House to facing many accusations, but I didn't expect to be accused of a policy of austerity this afternoon. When it comes to taxing the web giants, let me say this. We are clear on our intent to levy the GST, HST equally on all service providers in Canada. That's fair, and I know Canadians believe in fairness. And we also made very clear that while we much prefer working inside the OECD to have a multilateral approach to taxing corporate revenues of multinationals, if that job is not done, Canada will act unilaterally, and in January 2022, we will impose our own tax because that is fair too.
Outstanding.
All right, that is the question and answer portion of how this is going to unfold. We're now going to hear from the leader of the official opposition, Erin O'Toole, who will speak for 10-15 minutes to respond to the fiscal update. We'll take that in its entirety.
Has proven their government has no plan. Without a plan for vaccines, there can be no long-term plan for our economy. Without rapid testing in wide distribution, we've missed out on a critical medium-term tool, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of Finance in her speech seems to realize that she's putting the economy on hold. She'll say, we'll rebuild the economy once COVID is beaten. Well, Mr. Speaker, rapid tests could help preserve the economy, and the vaccine will help us beat it. This government is late and has no plan for both. That's right. Canadians should see that off the start. This year has been a very difficult year for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We all know that. 2020 will be remembered as the year a global pandemic came to our shores and took this government completely by surprise, despite many departments warning them for months. It will be remembered as a year of foreclosures, rising unemployment and uncertainty. Worse, for 12,000 Canadian families, it will be remembered as a year of grief and tragedy. Cette année a été difficile.
This year has been difficult for all, for younger Canadians and older Canadians. We will remember 2020 as the year that a pandemic took this government completely by surprise. A year of foreclosures, rising unemployment, and worse, a year of grief for the nearly 12,000 families who have lost a loved one. Canadians have shown courage. Canadians have followed public health directives and supported small business. Canadians have been there for their friends and families.
Canadians have shown courage and fortitude. They've respected directives from our health authorities. But Canadians are hurting. Canadians want their lives back. And this fall economic statement shows that they cannot rely on the Liberal government to get their lives back. Canadians are not difficult people, Mr. Speaker. They have complied, followed rules, they've tightened their belts. They're reassuring their worried children and taking care of aged parents. And to this effect, I'm really glad the Liberal government and the minister took my proposal from this spring on support for parents by boosting the Canada Child Benefit. There it was on page 10 of my leadership platform, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so glad the Liberal cabinet was reading it just as hundreds of thousands of Conservative members were.
Hear, hear.
Yes, I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, because this was a concrete proposal to help families, especially moms, working moms, juggling it all, helping families through the toughest time in our modern history. But we know that Canadians need more. As I said, Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker, and they've only asked one thing from this government, one simple thing. What is the plan, Mr. Speaker? For widespread use of rapid tests, what is the plan for rolling out the vaccine? When does it arrive? Who gets it first? Do we have the freezers for the -70 vaccine, Mr. Speaker? A robust portfolio in 2023 doesn't help us as we enter 2021. Well, Mr. Speaker, this fall economic statement answers the question on whether there is a plan. And it answers that no, there is not. And as the red ink on our balance sheet turns a dark crimson, we're facing a $399 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker, not $400 billion. No. It's a bit like 1999. You're not spending $20, Mr. Speaker. It's only $399 billion, Mr. Speaker. And Canadians know that not even half of that went to the emergency programs. This government is not providing a plan, they're not providing clarity, and it's clear, having been late on rapid tests on the border, there's no clarity or competence. Où est le plan, monsieur?
Where is the plan, Mr. Speaker? Millions of Canadians have been forgotten, left behind by the Liberals. The only thing that the government has to offer them, though, is more debt, less jobs, no vaccines, no clarity. Why did it take months for us to get rapid tests? Why don't all Canadians have access to rapid tests? When will we receive vaccines? Who will be vaccinated first? Today's announcements clearly demonstrate that the government is improvising. Canadians are tired of the government's incompetence and of their always delayed reactions.
Statement is another disappointment. Is that all they've got to say to the thousands of unemployed workers left behind by mismanagement of this government? Is that all they have to offer to Chris Rigas, owner of the Old Fire Hall restaurant in Niagara, who is struggling to get by because of restrictions? How does this statement help Rodney and Tina Grace, who've been working 7 days a week to keep their Best Western open in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia? 30% of the businesses in Surrey, British Columbia still don't qualify for the wage subsidy because of red tape and rules from this government. But most of their staff qualify for the CERB benefit. So guess which decision businesses are faced with? If this government spent half as much time meeting with real Canadians, small business owners, than they spend on photo ops, they would know that workers, small business owners, are asking for clarity. Canadians in a pandemic aren't asking them to ban single-use plastics. They're asking for details on when the vaccine gets here, how it's being distributed, how it's being preserved at -70. How can they save their aging parents from a senior's home or a hospital bed? This Prime Minister needs to get his priorities straight. But it's hard to take this government seriously when we know how this all started, Mr. Speaker. Think about how much better off Canada would have been if the Liberals had not shut down the pandemic early warning system. They did that in 2019, Mr. Speaker, without any consultation with scientists or with opposition parties in Parliament. Canada, for 20 years, had the world's leading pandemic early warning detection unit. It had helped stem the advance of H1N1, Mr. Speaker, of Ebola in other parts of the world. Canadians were helping protect others. But this government's incompetence led to that department not helping Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
Shame.
You heard that right. This government preferred to shut that down and rely on open source data from China, rather than intelligence work gathered by Canadian experts. As a result, we had zero warning of the incoming pandemic. In many ways, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government took the batteries out of our smoke detector. Le gouvernement libéral.
The Liberal government closed our borders 2 months too late. They also flip-flopped on the risks of contagion in person and on mask wearing. The Conservatives, though, have been good team players, Mr. Speaker. We tried to work with the government as much as we could. We tried to improve the government's erratic action. Most importantly, the Conservatives have been there for workers who really needed our help. We voted for emergency legislation, and we voted for programs to help workers. But the Prime Minister's leadership, his idea of leadership, is to tell Canadians to collect the CERB rather than to help workers keep their jobs. You really have to live in an ivory tower to think that that's what Canadians really want. Canadians want to go to work, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to sit home waiting for government checks.
This economic response has been erratic and confused at every step. Do you wonder why the Liberal government underspent on their own estimates for the wage subsidy by tens of billions of dollars while overspending on the CERB by tens of millions of dollars? They didn't have a plan to preserve the economy amid the storm of the pandemic. Millions more Canadians were put on the CERB than necessary when their jobs could have been maintained easily through an effective and swift wage subsidy. Cette approche illustre parfaitement la différence entre
This approach illustrates perfectly the difference between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. The Liberals believe that Ottawa has all the answers and must give orders. We believe that the best solutions come when Ottawa works in partnership with people on the ground. A partner, not a paternalistic one, as with the Prime Minister. But if only the Liberals had a clear plan. What we're hearing today is a panicked government burning money to hide its incompetence. This is unacceptable. Canadians deserve better.
Mr. Speaker, in both the military and in business, I know you have to learn from setbacks and failures. We must strive for excellence in what we do and promote an approach of continuous improvement. Teams do that, businesses do that, charities do that. Why does the Liberal government not do that? They haven't even learned from what they got wrong or slow in the first wave of the pandemic. We were last in line on rapid tests, Mr. Speaker, and now we're virtually last in line for vaccines. Countries with population of about 2.7 billion will be seeing the vaccine before Canadians, many this year, and we can't even get answers from this government on whether we have the logistics to receive it. The job of government in a crisis is to provide certainty, confidence in citizens that are worried, Mr. Speaker. We must provide a plan, clarity, stability, competence for those who rely on us. The upheaval we're seeing in our country lately is in large part because of the misguided measures of this government. Late on the border, late with programs, late with rapid tests, and now late with vaccines. While the Prime Minister prefers to compare himself to the worst student in the class when it comes to the spread of COVID-19, I want Canada to strive to be the best, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canadians expect. Unfortunately, we are far from that right now. After the ongoing rapid test debacle, and this week, Canadians are learning, even today, the Minister, in response to her speech, won't let us know which month next year vaccines will first start arriving. Our government had the duty to learn from its errors in the first wave, but instead of that, it's failed to provide vaccine for Canadians. At the same time, we'll be seeing vaccines roll out with all our allies. The Prime Minister has played the victim card. He said his government was helpless, that Canada didn't have the capability to manufacture vaccines. Now, not only is that complete rubbish, in the words of a leading scientist at the University of Ottawa, it's complete political spin, Mr. Speaker. And it also doesn't explain, well, why millions of people from Indonesia to Brazil will be receiving the vaccine before Canada will be. Again, the truth is the Liberal government was slow to respond, and they made a critical, and in sadly some cases fatal error, to put all their eggs in a basket with China, Mr. Speaker. And since the CanSino deal fell apart in August, this government has been scrambling to catch up, and they don't want anyone to know that they're months behind other countries. As I said earlier, countries with 2.7 billion people will be served before Canada. This means we're near the back of the line. While Americans are talking about mass vaccination throughout all of January, our government is only speculating about getting part of our population vaccinated by September. That means 10 extra months, Mr. Speaker, of health risks for Canadians, business closures, and economic uncertainty. Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health talks a great deal about the whole of government effort and the robust portfolio, but there's only one way to describe the performance of this government when it comes to vaccines: incompetent, Mr. Speaker. Canadians, in the midst of the second wave, would rather have one dose of the vaccine in the next month than the largest portfolio 18 months from now, Mr. Speaker. Ce gouvernement libéral n'inspire pas confiance.
This Liberal government does not inspire confidence. Let's talk about its purchase of $370 million for medical gowns paid to a company with almost zero experience, or their $237 million respirator contract to their friend Frank Baylis. The We Charity scandal revealed Liberal friends who are trying to profit during a pandemic, and at a time when the trust of citizens is so important, the Liberals continue to use their donor list to choose future judges. It's one scandal after another, Mr. Speaker. Uncertainty, lack of focus, huge expenses, special treatment for their friends, and disconnection from the reality of Canadians. Those are the only ways to describe this government. But the damage is real. There are millions of people who have lost confidence and who know they've been forgotten.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian economy was already showing serious signs of weakness before the pandemic hit. Ignoring our warnings, the Liberals took pride in running large structural deficits and raising taxes in good economic times. Ideological policies opposed by the entire country, like Bill C-69, tanker bans, pipeline cancellations, bad trade deals, and the inability to negotiate tariff avoidance has resulted in $160 billion leaving Canada before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Within 2 weeks of one another, a great Canadian company, Teck, canceled a $60 billion project for our GDP out west, and the world's most famous investor, Warren Buffett, pulled out billions from a project in the east. There were already signs being sent by this Prime Minister that Canada was not open to job creation or investment. At a time we need it, Mr. Speaker, it will take a change in government to change that sign for the world, Mr. Speaker. In British Columbia, we've seen half a dozen sawmills close, and our aluminum smelter in Kitimat, one of the greenest operations in the world of its kind, they were left out to dry in both NAFTA and aluminum tariffs. Canada was already at a crossroads under the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, before the pandemic, and they are setting this country up to, for the first time in our history, pass on to our children a country with less opportunity and more division, Mr. Speaker. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I want to prove it. The middle-class values that myself and many of our colleagues were raised with, Mr. Speaker, mine in Bowmanville, Ontario, taught me to work hard, help my neighbors, and strive to be the best I could be. I was taught to learn from setbacks, never accept failure, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and get better. This led me to serve 12 years in the Canadian Armed Forces alongside some of the most exceptional Canadian citizens around. It also led me to respect the value of hard work and perseverance and the nobility in work itself, Mr. Speaker. My first job was as a dishwasher and a short order cook, Mr. Speaker, in high school. And my last job before the military was with TransCanada, inspecting pipelines, back at a time before this government when that company was still proud to have Canada in its name, Mr. Speaker. I respect people, my colleagues do, that work hard to provide for their family, whether they're a uniformed and unionized plant worker or an entrepreneur, whether they work the night shift in Mississauga, Ontario, or get up at 5 a.m. to open their small business in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. There's a nobility in that act of discipline, perseverance, and working hard for your family. We cannot lose that in this country, Mr. Speaker. We will fight hard to ensure that we never lose touch with that fundamental value upon which Canadian society has been built. Je crois que c'est mon devoir.
I believe it is my duty to be a partner for the provinces and First Nations. I want to be a champion for small business and nonprofit organizations. I believe in the immense potential of our Canadian energy, our lumber, and our minerals. We produce the most ethical and environmentally friendly energy in the world. And we want greater engagement with First Nations to develop that energy. Reconciliation must be more than just talk, Mr. Speaker. It's not just about looking at the mistakes of the past. It's about having a real plan for the future. A plan that brings lasting pride and wealth to communities that are too often forgotten. The James Bay Cree and the Huron-Wendat in Quebec are an example for all of Canada.
This country working again, Mr. Speaker. Hard work emboldens the soul and builds a nation. Hard work helps families. Those families build communities and make us proud to be Canadian. Just think of Jacqueline and Barbara's 7 rooms home decor and gifts in Ocean Park, British Columbia. They bought the store just before COVID, Mr. Speaker. It's been extra tough for businesses like that. But Jacqueline and Barbara persevered, worked harder, rebranded, and they recently reopened. Congratulations, Jacqueline and Barbara. That is the Canadian spirit. They don't want more debt saddling the next generation. They just want an opportunity. They could have packed it in, but they didn't. They stayed open, they adapted, they persevered. When I questioned the Minister of Finance in the House on behalf of energy workers in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, she boasted about how many people she'd put on the CERB in that province. Albertans especially, but Canadians don't want the CERB, Mr. Speaker. They want the ability to get their lives back and to get back to work. They want a government that helps them build their livelihood in their communities rather than pushing them to close shop and move away. Because this is what it comes down to, a clash of vision between the somewheres and the anywheres, Mr. Speaker. Those who love their trade, their pursuit, and are loyal to local businesses versus those who the government wants to flock to a trendy job that is in no way connected to the community or the betterment of our country. And while this Prime Minister seems to think that every Canadian can simply work on their laptop from the local cafe, Mr. Speaker, that's not reality, nor is it what Canadians want. Conservatives are here to fight for those who build things in Canada, those who get their hands dirty and take pride in doing a job well before they come home for the night. And whether they're pulling the resources out of the ground in Canada or pulling resources out of their brain educated in Canada, we need to applaud and help them do that, Mr. Speaker. Hear, hear. That's why we were hoping for a plan for rapid tests, for vaccine. Unlike this finance minister, I don't want the economy to crash and be rebuilt after the pandemic. I want to save it and make sure it's stronger after the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. So we are here, Mr. Speaker, for the manufacturers, the aluminum and steel industry, the small business owner, the first-generation Canadian that started a business and now hire and employ 7 other families. We're here for the farmers and the commercial fishermen, Mr. Speaker. We're here for the Indigenous entrepreneur, the working mom and dad juggling childcare and the ability to get on the GO train to go into work in the city. We're here for those Canadians that want their lives back, that want the ability to work hard and want the ability to pass on to their children a Canada that is limitless in its potential, Mr. Speaker. And they deserve a government with a vision like that, not a government that is late at every step in the worst year in our modern history.
That's right.
Les travailleurs canadiens méritent.
Canadian workers deserve a government that fights for them, a government that is not obsessed with transitioning our industries in the midst of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker, a government that is patriotic and not afraid to fight on the world stage for rapid access to vaccines, a government that knows that Canada has an identity, a history, and that we can be proud of this.
And the rebuilding from it will take grit. It will take determination, perseverance, bold decision, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it will take a plan to chart our course forward. That's why it's so disappointing. After a record period without a budget, there's a stealth budget introduced today with no plan, Mr. Speaker. COVID has set us back, but COVID will not stop us. With the right ideas, with principled, ethical leaders who understand the value of a job, whether it's your first job out of school, Mr. Speaker, or your last job before retirement. With a government that will put the prosperity of all Canadians ahead of the special interests of a select few. If we have a government like this, Mr. Speaker, Canada will emerge from COVID-19 stronger, richer, and more determined than ever before. That's my mission. That's the mission of my colleagues with me here today, Mr. Speaker, and that must be our country's mission. And that's why I'm so disappointed with the Finance Minister's update today. There's no vision. There is no expression of values, including the value inherent in working Canadians. And the lack of a plan to address the most critical issues facing our country in one of the most challenging years in our country's history will only fuel the fears and uncertainties facing Canadian families across this great country. Mr. Speaker, now is not the time for experiments. Now is the time for experience. Now is not the time for building back with slogans. Now is the time we show we have our citizens' backs, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
We need to have a plan for the challenges we face today so that our children will have the same opportunities we did tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
All right, and that is the official response from the leader of the official opposition. It's a little bit different this year. We would normally be bringing you press conferences from the foyer of the House of Commons, but of course it's COVID, and so none of that is happening. We'll bring you some responses shortly from both the leader of the Bloc Québécois and the leader of the NDP. Allow me just to fact check a couple of things that the Conservative leader did say there, though. He said that the government has no plan for rapid testing. In fact, the country has more than 5 million rapid tests available in different provinces. It was revealed last week in a number of articles that some provinces have not used those rapid tests yet. And in an interview I did yesterday with the chairman of Moderna, we have purchased 20 million doses of vaccine from Moderna. He was quite insistent that Canada is not at the back of the line for those vaccines. It's true that we don't know exactly how things are going to unfold with the vaccine, but I did want to point out those two little facts before I bring in Vashi Kapelas to talk more about everything that we've heard over the past little while. There's an awful lot. So maybe let's start where we ended with Erin O'Toole and what you made of the positioning there. It did seem like an opportunity for Mr. O'Toole to also introduce himself to many Canadians who maybe don't know him as well, but he also had some harsh words for the government and what he called a stealth budget.
Yeah, this is such an interesting time. You were saying how it's presented differently in the House of Commons as well. We certainly wouldn't be expecting it to roll out this way. And I think it is a challenging time for the government to present a fiscal plan.
Sure.
And it's a challenging time politically for opposition parties to criticize that. And you've seen a little bit of how differently each of the parties are criticizing it. You heard a bit from the Conservatives about the size of the deficit and how big it was. In fact, right before Mr. O'Toole, the party's finance critic, said, we're running towards the edge of a cliff. But it becomes a bit harder then to say, well, what would you not spend money on, since so many of those supports were direct supports to individuals and businesses. And then there's sort of the other criticism that you could see weaved in and out of Mr. O'Toole's entire speech, which was around vaccines, which I think also sort of highlights that it's not normally you'd be criticizing the deficit or certain programs, or, it would just be so different. In this instance, it was some criticism of the deficit, and the majority of criticism was leveled against the federal government's vaccine plan, or how the opposition characterizes it, a lack thereof, in particular the distribution plan, because the government has established that they did procure quite a few millions, in fact, doses of vaccines. We just don't have an exact timeline of how they're going to roll out. And that is certainly something the opposition focused on, and Mr. O'Toole focused on in his remarks, which just sort of underscores for me that this isn't normal, that this isn't something that's just focused on the economy of the country or the size of the deficit. Right. And I think that line of criticism is not unique to even today, right? We've heard it already in previous days. So interesting to see how it all ties together, if it does, but it's very different than what we would normally see.
Yeah, and your point is well taken. I mean, vaccines are critical to all the economic plans that the government has going forward for economic growth. I wouldn't mind hearing you, because it was one of the questions to the finance minister from Pierre Poilievre around the size of the deficit. Again, some things not quite accurate in what Mr. Poilievre said, for instance, comparing it to what it was in the 1990s. The debt servicing costs currently are much, much lower than they were in the 1990s, only 1%, I think, of GDP in 2021. So it's a bigger deficit. It costs a lot less for us to pay for it. But the government has now introduced yet another new fiscal anchor, something they're calling now fiscal guardrails. And Canadians might be having a hard time keeping up on how they're justifying, explaining what they're going to do in order to get back on a road to growth, because even I have a hard time keeping track too, Vashti. So wouldn't mind your take on that part.
Yeah, it is interesting. It sounds like, first of all, on the size of the deficit, that's a really interesting thing to look at, because there's the deficit now, but actually if you dig deeper in the document, the government has the deficit by 2025 sitting somewhere around $25 billion. So they do have a path, and we haven't seen that for a really long time, a path to what it might look like, depending, of course, on economic factors. When it comes to how they tackle that deficit, or what they use to kind of anchor the economy or guide them going forward, there wasn't an explicit description of a so-called fiscal anchor, and that's something that they had signaled before. That is a criticism of the official opposition as well. But they did introduce this concept, as you mentioned, Rosie, of fiscal guardrails, kind of indicators. My impression is what I heard Minister Freeland talk about, it's sort of indicators, especially when they introduce stimulus post the pandemic into the fiscal recovery, into the economic recovery. When they introduce stimulus, how will they decide when to taper that stimulus off? And it sounds like they're going to look at these guardrails being unemployment, employment, and hours worked as the key indicators. We don't know what they have to say in order for them to determine the level of stimulus, but that's what they'll be looking at to guide the amount of money they inject into the economy.
Okay, that was a good explanation. Thank you for that, Vashti. I'll bring in David Cochrane in a moment. Peter Armstrong, we'll go to him first, because obviously a lot of different and new measures here, Peter, for businesses who have been looking for, again, more supports. It does sound, too, like the government is recognizing that some of these industries and specific areas do need more support.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting to see how they sort of frame that, right? Like they're talking about the tourism and hospitality industry. Not just is that sort of the last real vestige of where the damage is still being done every day. We haven't seen those jobs come back online. There's no real path for them to get back online. And the government points out there's 750,000 workers. That's 2% of Canada's GDP. And a lot of them are young people, women, people of color, Indigenous people. And what sort of protections, what kind of scaffolding can they put around those jobs in that industry to try to help them get through the crisis and then try to reopen? And, you and I have talked before about what does stimulus look like on the other side of this? Because it might not necessarily just be spending. It might just be confidence and getting back out and spending a night in a hotel and going to a show and feeling that we're okay once that sort of moment of feeling okay does come back around.
Okay, and in terms of growth, in terms of what the government is looking at for growth over the next number of years, as we were talking before we went on air, there are different scenarios here because the government recognizes things could go different ways.
Yeah, they've come up with these alternative economic scenarios. So like what happens if we have to extend the current restrictions? That, the businesses that are closed stay closed and, schools stay open, but we basically stay in the situation we're in now for longer. Well, that would have a negative impact. It would sort of hurt some people. It would there are people that are on the edge of the wave right now that would get pushed over. The other one, though, is the bigger one. That what happens if it gets worse? What happens if the measures we put in place now don't work and we've got to up those restrictions? We have to go back to a shutdown like we saw, a lockdown like we saw in the spring, that maybe schools close for a longer period over Christmas. Well, that would have a real big impact. They're looking there at, instead of 4.8% growth, we're looking at like 2.9%, way more people losing their jobs, way more businesses that have been able to just kind of hold on. They wouldn't be able to survive, would eventually go under. So they have mapped out what those scenarios might look like, but they're fairly confident that the forecast they're going off of, which is mostly just the big banks, of course, that's where we think we'll be out, maybe a year or 10 months from now.
Okay, Peter Armstrong, thank you, senior business reporter. I know you've got demands elsewhere, so I'll let you go. Thank you, sir. And let me bring in senior parliamentary reporter David Cochrane now, too. David, I was as the finance minister was delivering her speech, I was thinking about something you used to say a lot in the first wave, which was about bridging businesses, bridging Canadians. And I feel like now it's a bridge to the vaccine. Like that's sort of what the government is trying to establish here.
Yeah, and that's an essential point that Chrystia Freeland made right near the end of her speech, where she said Canadians can and should avail themselves of the federal programs now available. The safety net is there now so that people can make the right decisions to protect our health. They've bumped the wage subsidy back up to 75% from 65%. The rental assistance is being extended into March. There is sector-specific targets for the air sector, if not the airlines, but also tourism, hospitality, restaurants, hotels. There is now money there for them in the form of loans and different direct aid for people, for example, who work in live performances and art and entertainment, so that they can be bridged to this better time, because I think we can all agree a vaccine would be better time. And it's almost like the incentive is there now. The economic certainty is there. It's been extended even beyond the CERB, the CRB, and the initial wage subsidy program to get you there and to make the smart, safe choice. You contrast that with the deep vein of frustration that Aaron O'Toole is trying to trap into, saying Canadians want their life back. And he is 100% right on that. But his response to this today was less a response to the measures in the fiscal update and more an attempt to prosecute the federal government's handling of everything, going back to the outbreak of the virus in China, and also drawing stark cleavages between himself and them for the upcoming federal election, whenever that will be. But you're right, Rosie, there was a real attempt to talk about bridging here, that the end is in sight. So now is not the time to let your guard down. Now is the time to really buckle down and double down on public health measures. And it sort of reminds me of something that the Prime Minister has apparently been saying in the private meetings with the premiers, in that making the comparison to where we are now with the vaccines coming in this stage of the pandemic and not rushing to loosen restrictions too quickly, to sort of like being the soldier who gets killed like 10 minutes before the armistice. Don't be that person. Stay safe and hunker down. And these measures are designed to do just that.
Yeah, and it is, as we said off the top, a difficult balance, certainly, to try and find an enormous amount of money, adding $55 billion new spending since July, while at the same time thinking about what a recovery would look like, and adding to that the fact that the recovery might indeed be part of your election platform, because that's a reality. And certainly if you're going into a budget promising childcare and pharmacare and who knows what else, you could well see how we might end up down that road.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of things not here, right? As much as there is here, there's a lot of things not here, like the full details of the stimulus plan. There's no bailout for airlines. That is something still being negotiated. Pete, the government is insistent that they give people refunds for their tickets before they get aid, and they're talking about changing some of these big credit facility programs they've created to help them out, but that's not there. The oil and gas sector specifically and acutely in need, there's nothing tailor-made for them in this. And pharmacare and childcare is very much notional down payments to start the process. And Rosie, there's also the $28 billion a year, every year, that the premiers want on healthcare money. There's going to be a meeting sometime in the next 10 or 12 days with the First Ministers to talk about that. That is not here as well.
That's right.
So the deficits that are there, they are staggering and they are high, but they should be temporary because so much of it is caused by the need to put essentially 60% of the country on the government payroll while the economy has been put into a medically induced coma to try to keep everybody safe. So costs should go down and revenues should come back up, and the real decision process begins in how do you start getting back to normal when it's safe to do so.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the federal health care transfers, David, because there was a mention of that in the document where it said that as a result of the Safe Restart Agreement alone, federal health support for provinces and territories is up by 23% relative to previous fiscal years. I'm sure that's something that was a direct message to the provinces. David, I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes. Someone else that was very concerned about health care transfers, and as David says, there's no exact date for that First Minister's meeting, although we are expecting it to happen before Christmas. Yves-François Blanchet, the Bloc Québécois leader, spoke a few moments ago. Here's some of what he had to say.
One might be tempted to say that our position is based on the fact that we believe Quebec should be elsewhere than in this federation. But actually, the situation is that every prime minister in Canada says about the same thing. This money should be transferred to Quebec and the provinces without any condition. And a few days before a conference between the Prime Minister of Canada and the primes of the provinces and of Quebec, the Prime Minister says through the voice of Mrs. Freeland that he intends to impose conditions before coming to help those who are the most in need of some kind of support through health care, which is a jurisdiction of the provinces and of Quebec. I do not believe that the issue, for the time being, is a total amount or a precise moment that we will reach in order to have achieved this or that goal, because we do not know entirely how we will come out or when we will come out of this crisis. We only know that it will be later in Quebec and Canada than it will be in the United States or Germany or United Kingdom, for instance. The question is, what do we do in the meantime? And what does not seem acceptable is that all this money is being spent without having any consideration, something in the heart for the most vulnerable of people. And because we are supposed to come out of this crisis in the coming weeks and months, there should be much more precisions about what will be invested in the relance. That's a good word, relance. Restart will be good. It proves that we don't have to use it often in the restart of the economy, which is the most important thing. Each time you take somebody who's not working and you put this person to work, it's one less expense for the government and one more income for the government. So this is something that has to be planned very precisely, very rapidly, and not be submitted to the electoral agenda of this government.
And do you feel that that is the case? Has the government laid the foundation for a long-term economic prosperity of the country as part of a reset, or are you concerned that this will lead to just basically mountains of debt and not the economic benefits that
they have renounced the very idea of controlling deficit. They will refuse to speak about it. Each time somebody will say, isn't the deficit getting a bit high? They will be told that this is something that cannot be considered in present time. And they basically say that there is no limit to what they will spend, without saying or without admitting how badly sometimes they do spend it, and the past hasn't been so great about that. So that seems to be laying the foundation of an electoral position for them.
That's the Bloc leader speaking just moments ago. He did mention money for a restart. A reminder, the government has committed $100 billion, as much as $100 billion, $70 to $100 billion for that restart. Although we don't know the details about where that money will go. That will come in budget 2021. Now let's bring you a bit of what the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh had to say about today's economic update.
Three key things that we pointed out earlier. none of those have been addressed. We see a Liberal government that is not willing to ask the wealthiest to pay their fair share. They have not really taken any concrete steps to look at revenue sources from the pandemic profiteers, the excess profits made during this pandemic, nor a tax on wealth. They're in fact not even willing to really put in place any real tax measure on the web giants, those who are making massive, if not record profits off the backs of people in our country, continue to pay virtually no tax in our country. And nothing that the Liberal government has done has really changed that. They have not put in place the help to sectors that are in need. I think about the aerospace and workers of the airline industries, workers in the tourist sectors. The workers of the hardest hit sectors can't count on any help, nor is that help that's being proposed, the small gestures being proposed, nor are those gestures even tied directly to jobs. So again, nothing for workers in those hard hit sectors. And finally, when the vaccines represented a light at the end of the tunnel, knowing that Canada will not get the vaccine quickly and might have to wait very long to receive the vaccine, that light at the end of the tunnel now feels like a longer and darker tunnel. So given that we've said that we need to see more help from more people and to see that help in long term, the Liberal government has not announced. And in fact, they've done the opposite. They're announcing effectively in their economic update that the help that people receive will be cut year over year. So this is the exact opposite of what people need. Absent making sure that the wealthiest pay their fair share, absent a tax on pandemic profiteering or those who have profited massively off of the pandemic, the large corporations that have done so, the burden is going to fall on people as Liberal and Conservatives push towards cutting the help that people receive. And that is only going to make things worse. The wealthiest have seen massive profits, and everyone else has seen a mix of getting by or seeing their jobs and their businesses shut down and losing their economic stability. That's the result of the current path that the Liberal government's on. We're going to continue to fight to make sure people get the help they need. The Liberal government also has not really put forward any clear plan to fight the climate crisis. Their small gestures and small initiatives in this are not significant enough to really create the jobs that we know are possible if we made the right investments into tackling the climate crisis and creating jobs in the recovery. But what I was hoping for more specifically is like an acknowledgement that there are a lot of Canadians that have lost their jobs and are afraid that they're going to lose their jobs because their companies have just barely hung on. And what we're going to see and what we've already seen is very clearly a different reality for different people. If you're talking about the richest Canadians, the billionaires, they've actually seen their wealth increase during the pandemic. But if you think about small businesses, think about small restaurants, your community coffee shops, or local, restaurants that you enjoy, or you think about, the tourist sector or the airline industry, talking about the mechanics that work on the planes, thinking about the folks that work on the airlines, the flight attendants. These are people that they've lost their jobs and they're not going to get those jobs back for a while. These are sectors that are hard hit, and they're saying we need help directly, and that help has to be tied to jobs. So it can't just be what the Conservatives did in 2008, which is cutting blank checks to these companies that took the money and then shut down their operations and opened up in lower cost jurisdictions. So we want to see help directly to companies and to people that is tied to their jobs. And that is not something that the Liberal government has really rolled out. They've not rolled out any sector-specific supports meaningfully that's directly tied to jobs. And that's what we were hoping to see. But the big failure when it comes to the Indigenous communities, the biggest failure of this economic update is that they are really woefully lacking when it comes to the funding for housing. And that has been identified by all Indigenous communities, whether we're talking about reserve, in urban settings, across the country. The biggest concern in the north, in Nunavut, is housing and the lack of adequate housing. And the fact that this economic update really says nothing meaningful about investing in housing is a big failure. But on water, they'll miss their target that they set, but it looks like they've now acknowledged that and are putting forward some decent funding on that side.
Okay, that is the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. A couple of things just of note to fact check. There is, in fact, a significant commitment to community infrastructure in Indigenous communities, $25 million in 2021, $1.8 billion over 7 years, starting in 2021-22, for infrastructure projects, which would include housing. One of the places that was touched on during this update, businesses in the hospitality and tourism industries have been obviously hurt because of the pandemic restrictions. Thousands and thousands of people across the country work in those sectors. Some businesses have had access to wage and rent support, which is now being extended. The government is putting aside an additional 25% of what's called a regional relief and recovery fund for tourism-related businesses. Low-interest loans of up to $1 million have also been announced. For more on this, I'm joined by Vivek Sharma, the CEO of Fairmont Hot Springs Resort in British Columbia, where everyone would probably hope to be right now. Vivek, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Your resort is open with some limited guests. You know, travel is not top of mind for everybody. Tell me whether you heard anything here today that will make a difference for you.
Well, yes, I would, start by saying that we're thankful for whatever support, we're getting from the federal, provincial, or any government level, So these new measures announced today are obviously welcome. And as we say, the devil is in the detail, especially when it comes to the additional debt opportunity. We'll have to see what the details around that are and how can businesses access that actually.
Had you been using the wage subsidy program previously?
We have been, and that's been a huge help, not just to our business, but the industry in general and variety of businesses across the country. So that's been a huge help for us.
And what about the rent program it wasn't of any use for you right now because you are using your facility right now?
Correct, yeah. And I mean, we own our assets,
okay.
So we didn't really have a challenge with the rent per se.
There does seem to be some specific other relief that you could tap into, sort of targeted towards your industry. Do you think that enough attention has been paid to the hospitality sector overall?
I think we are in a situation where no amount of attention is enough, but I do want to acknowledge, the support that the government has given. The additional $1 million that the availability that was announced today, I think the big question would be that those businesses, especially in the hospitality sector, which are already highly leveraged, they couldn't access the previous BDC or EDC debt support that was announced in the spring. Right. So is there any plans for the government to lower the risk assessment so that these highly leveraged businesses can access those things, because that's the only way to help our cash crunch at this time.
I talked to a fellow in PEI yesterday, Vivek, who with a family-owned hotel, the oldest place on PEI, and he was really worried and had at previous times worried about whether his business would survive. You're at a much larger organization, a much larger resort. Tell me what it's been like for you.
It's been extremely challenging, and the challenge or the size of the challenge really, whether it's a small business or a large corporation, it remains the same because the magnitude of the challenge just keeps increasing. And as an industry, we are almost at the end of the runway where we may not see a tourism industry in the spring of 2021 if measures continue the way they are right now.
Okay, and so what would you say to Ms. Freeland if she was listening to you right now, Vivek?
I think what I would say to Ms. Freeland is that the time has come for some targeted, specific, industry-specific support, which can aid in liquidity. That's what the need of the hour is. And we really can't, drown us in debt any further.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, they have announced this new highly affected sectors credit availability program, 100% government guaranteed financing. But I don't know what that would mean for a large organization like you. So I guess you'll wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see. And like I said, if it's guaranteed by the government, do we still qualify for it? And it's still a debt, which needs to be serviced at some point.
For sure. Okay, Vivek Sharma, thank you for making the time for us today. Appreciate it. Good to see you. Stay well.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
That's Vivek Sharma. He's CEO of Fairmont Hot Springs in Banff, where we would all like to be right now, probably. Let me now talk about long-term care homes. The government did announce today a fund of up to $1 billion for infection control. It also committed to looking at national standards, something that has to do with the provinces. But this $1 billion would train 4,000 new personnel support workers. It would try and get those standards in place. My next guest has a family member in a Winnipeg long-term care home, her 90-year-old mother. Hi to you, Lisa Streifler. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
What do you make of the government committing to $1 billion to try and keep long-term care homes safe?
I think it's excellent. I think it's long overdue. It's much needed. There's a huge crisis going on right now.
And I know that cases are very high still in Manitoba. What is the situation for your mom?
My mom was tested last week twice for the virus, and I got a notice today that she was tested again today. So now I'm waiting to hear.
And how has her care been? What is the state of the long-term care home there?
Well, on her floor, we just got an announcement that three people have tested positive. 3 staff members have tested positive. So residents have tested positive. 24 people in the home have had the virus, residents, and 8 have died to date.
And your mom's, sorry, I don't know your mom's name. What's your mom's name?
Sheila.
Sheila, and Sheila's 90. So how is her health? How worried are you about her?
I'm very worried. She's extremely vulnerable, like most of the residents. I don't think she'll handle something like this well. You know, I mean, it's the worst thing I could imagine happening. So I just feel like she's like like just sitting there. Anything could happen to her, and now I've heard that it could have. You know, I have to wait now, and I have to wait a couple days to find out.
Right. And the fact that this is happening now, this money, I know money was given previously, but that this money's coming and that now governments are turning to the idea of national standards, and the fact that that might be too late for your mom, even if she's fine, it's still only going to happen over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm concerned about all personal care homes.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about everything that's going on, which I didn't know about until 3 years ago when my mother went into one.
Yeah.
And I think that's the sad part of all this, that most people who don't have an involvement in personal care don't know what's going on. And this is not a unique thing that's just happened now. This has been going on for years and years, this problem. It's just the pandemic has brought it to light.
Yeah, I also didn't really know about it, and that's probably, part of the good thing about the pandemic is that now maybe it will be fixed. What would be your hope going forward for changes to long-term care, Lisa?
I hope that the staffing will be increased, and that right now we need rapid testings because the staff are asymptomatic, the ones that are spreading it, because they're still at work. They don't know that they have the virus. So we need rapid testing on site in the personal care homes for the residents and the staff. I guess the other way around, staff and residents. And but we need more workers. There aren't enough staff, enough personal support workers. And the result of that is that their job is very stressful. And the residents don't get the attention they need. They don't get, when they call for help, it's not answered in due time.
Yeah. Lisa, I wish the best to you and your mom. Maybe we can check back and see what happens with the COVID test and see how she's doing, if you don't mind.
Oh, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa Streifler in Winnipeg. Thank you. Thanks for making the time. All right, Thank you. Let's bring back my colleagues, Vashi Kapelis and David Cochran now. Vashi is going to take over coverage here in about 10 minutes, and she'll have lots of analysis and reaction and an interview with Chrystia Freeland as well. Vashi, I mean, what should Canadians take away from this? It is, as we pointed out earlier, the first really detailed look at the country's finances since March of 2019. It's almost astounding how much has changed. I was just going to pull out what the deficit was then. It was $34.4 billion in 2019-2020. So to think of all the things that have changed and the government has had to do and the amount of debt it has had to take on.
Yeah, I think that is sort of underscored by what I walk away from reading this document and listening to the comments, thinking that while there was a feeling in the summer like the worst of it could be over, and therefore the government could acclimatize its response in correspondence with that, and various governments, to be fair, could. That feeling seems to have been erased, and that's reflected in what we heard today, both through what the government presented and how the opposition reacted. So while there are thoughts to what may occur when a recovery happens, I remember months ago sitting with you talking about how we expected the summer update to be all about that recovery. Yeah. And in fact, it talked about it, but now it's almost been put aside. And yes, there are some signals about what it will include, but certainly the majority of what's presented today by the government and then criticized by the various opposition parties in different way is still about how they are responding to the needs of people. And as we just heard from your guest, the healthcare needs of people, the economic needs of people and businesses in this country right now, because we are in some cases in a worse off spot when it comes to the pandemic than we were months ago. And that just sort of really hit home for me through what we heard from everything today.
Yeah, David, I mean, it's true that things are, they are worse in some parts of the country, and they are still bad mostly everywhere. So how you sort of lay out a fiscal plan going forward is a challenge, but it's also one that the government needed to do. I mean, they needed to show us and give us a sense of what things look like.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, Rosie, is that we're still very much in the emergency phase of spending. I know we all want that emergency phase to end and the recovery phase to begin, and that sort of felt like it was happening back around Labor Day, and it does not feel like it is happening as we get closer to Christmas Day. And I think that's a big lesson in all of this. I mean, look at the measures that are there. They've extended the wage subsidy out to June, and it's going to be topped up to 75%, boosted from 65% until March. So you have those sort of measures, and the rental subsidy being enriched and expanded and extended because there is a recognition that businesses need to be kept whole for a longer period of time than was anticipated when these programs were first launched, with varying degrees of success and failure. But if you look at the longer-term economic picture, just look at the stimulus spending promise. I know it's kind of gray and amorphous. It's up to $100 billion, excuse me, over 3 years. That tells you that we will be in this for several years. I don't mean the lockdowns. I mean the vaccines provide, an end to that should the rollouts happen and the approvals come. But in the best case scenarios in this document, economic activity and employment levels are about 18 to 24 months away from getting back to pre-pandemic levels in the best scenarios, up to 5 years in the worst scenarios. So even when we get through this emergency phase and the spending can wind down a little bit and the reopening can begin to some degree, it's going to take a long time to get back to pre-COVID normal, if we can even go back to that. And this is in the aggregate. On an individual level, it may never really kind of happen. I mean, the best indicator we have is kind of for the really hard hit sectors like airlines, for example. After the global financial crisis of a decade ago, it took until about 2015 to get back to normal. And that was after the shock of 9/11 took a bunch of years for air travel to get back to normal. We are going to go through a similar phase like that again. So as big as the spendings and investments and supports are outlined here today and in past events, there will need to be more in the future to do that, and also to solve the social inequities the government has been pointing to in the pandemic. How the newest, the poorest, and the oldest Canadians have been the most affected by this. The investments that need to be made to help racialized Canadians, new Canadians, and quite frankly, women get back to an economic level, that's going to take some serious time.
Yeah, and as you say, this is all assuming that things sort of go as we would hope, and not that things would get worse or there would be a third wave. I think Dr. Fauci on the weekend said that, for instance, the United States seemed to be seeing a surge upon a surge. So, that's hoping that nothing like that happens here. I want to get one last thought from both of you on the politics of this, because yes, it's an economic document, it's a support document for Canadians, but there's lots of politics at play here too. Vashi, what would you point Canadians to there?
Well, the criticism is very different depending on the party that is criticizing what the government has put forward. The Conservatives they said that the deficit was too high, and their main critique focused on vaccinations and a plan for distributing them, or what they would say is a lack thereof of a plan. A polar opposite approach from the New Democrats, for example, who were focused on, I think Peter Julian in the House of Commons talked about that there being too much austerity in what was put forward, which kind of, he was heckled a little bit almost in the House of Commons, and a little bit of a sort of joke made by Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, out of that, saying, I expected a lot of criticism for a lot of things, but probably not that, just given the size of what they put forward. So very different approaches. I mean, there's more to what the NDP was saying, and we'll have the leader of the party, Jagmeet Singh, on a little bit to talk about that. But then, from the Bloc Québécois, more specifics on healthcare transfers. And I imagine that's where a lot of the conversation from provinces will go as well. So I think politically it wasn't unsurprising. Like I wasn't shocked by any of the criticism that came forward. I also wasn't really shocked by much of what the government put forward too. It was kind of to be expected.
Okay, Vashi, thank you for your help with this coverage. Vashi's going to take over coverage here in 5 minutes' time, so stay tuned for a 2-hour edition of Power and Politics and full analysis, as well as interviews with all the big players. David, let me get one more thought from you on the politics of all this.
Yeah, it seems if you listen to the opposition parties, their essential assumption is that the government has failed Canadians broadly, and they all get to their judgment of failure by taking very different paths. I mean, if you listen to Erin O'Toole, there's the frustration that we're still in various stages of economic lockdown, that perhaps testing and various things haven't accelerated to the point that they would like it. Even though many of those things are not necessarily within political control, those are the decisions of health regulators, and many of these things are not in federal control. They are the jurisdiction and the provenance of the provinces, and there's always a feistiness whenever you try to intrude into their sphere of responsibility. The New Democrats, it's interesting that the biggest deficit really since the Second World War is being described as austerity by Peter Julian.
I bet you they won't say that again, I would guess.
They may not. I mean, look, they have been consistent on wanting to see broad-based reforms to the tax structure in Canada, to go after wealth taxes and different things like this. And these are fundamental conversations that we may want to have in a time where there has been pandemic profiteering. But I go back to this central point that we're still very much in an emergency phase of trying to put a financial floor under people. And it's hard to think about redecorating the house when the house is still on fire and the fire department hasn't quite left. I mean, if you look at where these conversations started in September, we're looking at a throne speech that promised a great, ambitious green agenda, or at least the spin leading up to the throne speech projected these things. And look at where we are with the second wave now, with Alberta as a cauldron, for example. There are very fundamental, immediate crises in front of governments at every level that still need to be dealt with. And it's very difficult, I think, to wrap your head around long-term structural changes to things when you're trying to figure out how to keep the main streets of Canada alive and ensure that small businesses and the Canadian family are too big to fail in this crisis.
I only have about a minute, David, but I mean, it did strike me in the response from opposition leaders that you can start to see sort of the frame of what the economic debate, or what the debate around what this country looks like going forward starts to look like. From Erin O'Toole saying that this government has been too paternalistic, that people need to get back to work, that they're willing to do what's needed, to the NDP calling for more of this, that, and the other. I mean, you can sort of start to see the thread lines of how that conversation goes when Canadians are ready to have it, because I'm not sure it's now.
Yeah, and I think the final point, if we look at like the fiscal guardrails that Chrystia Freeland talked about today, I think that will guide how they approach it, the Liberals do as a government, in that they're not going to look at GDP rates getting back to a certain level, or economic output on the aggregate level getting back to a certain level. They want to look at the economic well-being of individual Canadians, and that's employment levels, the employment rate, the unemployment rate, but more importantly, hours worked. Because it's not just Canadians losing jobs in this crisis, it's losing full-time employment or having their hours slashed down to such a point that it's not enough to live on. And that's what a lot of these support programs have been about. So as we move forward to whatever this stimulus and recovery is, and whenever it does begin in earnest, that's going to be interesting to see exactly what they land on there, what the indicators are to either ramp up or wind down stimulus spending as needed.
Okay, David, thank you for all your help with our coverage. You can watch David tonight on The National. He'll bring you all the highlights too. A reminder that the government here is promising $1 billion in new stimulus starting sometime next year, outlining already promises to follow through with a national childcare plan, a pharmacare plan, promising $1 billion right now to help keep long-term care centres safe. But really, this is a document that is about trying to protect Canadians and keep them alive, and trying to see how we will recover what that stimulus will look like. That is the end of our special coverage of today's Fall Economic Update. Thank you for watching. Coming up on CBC News Network, Power and Politics with Vashi Kopelas. As I said, all the big hitters will be there for interviews with Vashi. I'll see you later for a special ad issue tonight on The National. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks so much for watching. See you soon.